Good morning. So this is an intimate setting. I like this. The last of these I went to, I think, was the one where we had a guest from Japan, and they recorded it at the KMU center. You know, where there's like right over here, there's an old 1970s kitchen set for doing a cooking show, and over here there's like a library for. And I was worried that there was going to be one of those in this building that I was going to do, but this is much. Yeah, this is a lot closer to what I expected when they said donuts and disasters. So I like that. My name's Josh Barbour, and I don't think there's actually anyone online yet. And so since we're more of an intimate group, do you all already know each other? Everybody, maybe we could just go around and say sort of name, rank, and serial number. You know, name and where you're from and what brought you here.
I'm John DeLeo. I'm from New Orleans, and I'm working in Dr. Murphy's lab.
Frank Whitman, and I'm a professor in computer science.
Michael Johnson, and I'm in engineering technology and industrial history.
Steve Warren,
Jamie Masterson, I'm on the housing direction of
Yeah, I'm also in practice in hospital object at Oakland, and I'm associate director for hazard protection and defense.
John Meyer, I'm a postdoc in the hazard reduction.
It's nice to meet you all. I'm in communication in Bolton Hall. We're next to the big tree, century tree. Not everybody knows where we are, but I'm going to talk about something we call the Stormwater Footprint Quiz. It's a little app that a team of undergraduate students, graduate students, and faculty developed. And before I talk about the Stormwater Footprint Quiz itself and the assessment that we did of it, I want to sort of situate it within the larger context of my research, just to kind of give you a taste of the hazards work that I do more generally. And if you're curious, you can't really read it, but my website is macromorphic.com/blog, and I created a little landing post for this presentation. And there's a lot of links there about the app when it initially came out, and these slides are there if you want to grab them. And also the thank yous to the collaborators that worked on this project. Really the leader of this project, the leader of the creation of the Stormwater Footprint Quiz, was a professor of civil engineering, Emily Zeckman, now Emily Berglund. She got married after she moved to NC State. And Alex Brinston was from computer science, and he was also on the project. And really, the faculty played, one of the great things about it was really the faculty playing more of a sort of guide on the side instead of leading the team. And the students, and just so I don't forget anyone, Tommy Jo Scott, Alyssa Polite, Sean Sathoff, Sam Collard, Marcio, I'm not going to be able to pronounce his last name. I think it's Giacomoni, maybe? Jenna Sharanda Damodaram, and Avery White. This was the student team. Not all of them are pictured here. This is from their trip to DC when we went to the EPA P3 competition. The EPA P3 mechanism is a really interesting funding mechanism. We should probably thank the EPA as well, because they ponied up about $10,000 for the project. And that funded some time, but mainly it funded the trip, the student trip to DC to go to the science fair, which was essentially what it was. It was a lot of fun. You know, they got to be in DC, and also they won an honorable mention for their hard work. So I'll talk about the Stormwater Footprint Quiz, but before I do that, I want to situate this in, as I said, the larger context of my work. We'll then talk about the Stormwater Footprint Quiz. We'll talk about the experimental evaluation of the quiz that I played a part in, and the liberal arts students played a part in. And then we'll talk about the Stormwater Footprint Quiz. You know, I think that Robin wanted me to talk about this mainly because it has something to do with stormwater, and with our emphasis on flooding coming up, that sort of made sense. But another thing that is exciting about this for me is that the quiz is an example of, I think, the sort of best work that can be done at the intersection of scholarship, teaching, and practice. And so that is very exciting for me in that respect as well. And then I'll talk about just the potential of this kind of project in general in disaster studies, and then hopefully reserve most of the time for discussion. So mainly my work is something that in communication we call communication design. And for the engineers in the room, you all have vibrant design disciplines, but believe it or not, design is something in communication that's really more implicit. The design, this impulse to intervene in communication is embedded in a lot of communication research, but it is not explicitly reflected on to the extent that we might learn from studying the design process itself. So theory and research are aimed at improving communication, of intervening in communication, but there's very little study of the process through which we figure out how to intervene, or the process through which communities, organizations, and individuals intervene in communication. This is a quote from Harrison, and this is a piece that's just recently out that is trying to change that to help us think more explicitly about how design happens in communication. And in the same extent that we design cars and computers, we can design messages and flows or conversations. We can design interaction formats. We can design communication tools. But there's a lot of value in studying how we design cars and computers, just like there should be a lot of value in designing how we design messages and how we design conversations and how we design tools and technologies and interaction formats. And that's essentially the argument that Harrison is making in this piece. I think the scholars that are probably credited most centrally in our field with bringing that kind of larger design impulse into communication more explicitly are Ackes and Jackson. And what's probably most exciting about it is, and what's most exciting about communication, my communication research in general these days, is the potential for using research and theory to understand and intervene in practice. And the Stormwater app sort of gets at that to the extent that we can learn something about how a group thinks about communication, the assumptions that they have about communication, their sort of implicit theories of how communication works and how it should work that are embedded in the choices they make about the app, as well as just the sort of evaluation of the design of a particular message, which is what I would think of as the app, is that it is really, when you see the quiz, we're going to play it today, so when you see the quiz, you'll see that it's really more of a message than it is an interactive game, and that's something we'll talk about as well. And I think that this impulse for studying communication design is particularly valuable for disaster studies, because there are a lot of communication challenges during disasters, before disasters, after disasters, communicating with the public through media, the sort of communication networks of first responders and how they manage information, which is really what I'm interested in, the rhetoric and practice of policy making around preparation, and these are just to name a few. I mean, we could probably come up with a lot more just around this table. And so my work in general is about trying to apply different models of communication to figure out how you might redesign messages, conversations, interaction formats, and tools to make them better, but also the collective design work that goes into making them. These are just some examples of work that I've done where I'm studying particular messages, for example, trying to understand the factors, the organizational factors that encourage more or less sophisticated messages between stakeholders during organizational change. This is a study that is probably closer to the interests of Donuts and Disasters. My work with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission focuses on how inspectors create communication processes to conduct safety oversight. My co-author on this, Rebecca Gill, calls it the meetings paper, because mainly what we write about in this paper are these repetitive meetings that the regulators created to try and keep on track issues that are emerging at nuclear power plants. But I've also done work with volunteer responders, mainly pre-crisis. I really have an interest in sort of preparation as a kind of mundane time in organizations, and how do you begin to study preparation in a way to make it more responsive during a disaster? Because even with rapid grants, you were mentioning the rapid grants that you all won for the study of what happened in West, even with those, right, it would have been, how much more insight might we have had if we'd already done a study in West? I mean, it doesn't happen like that, but that's sort of the impulse, is how do we connect preparation, response, and recovery. And I mentioned the hazardous materials study that I did in Fort Bend, where we were looking at the information networks and the expertise coordination between first responders, but first responders focused on hazardous material response in particular. And the idea is that there's a greater expertise burden when you're dealing with hazardous materials, and there's a greater specialization among first responders, right? Not all first responders are familiar with sort of all of the sorts of hazmat they might have to deal with, and it's certainly a problem for Texas, right? When you think about the oil and gas, especially, industries and the need. And that brings us to the app to enable communities, community members to be aware of the different development options that they have, and how those development options, writ large, have consequences not just for their own home, but also for communities at large. I think when most of us think about stormwater, we think about what governments do to manage stormwater, what the state of Texas does, which I think is mainly build really big concrete ponds. But increasingly, I think there's an understanding that the decisions of developers, the decisions of homeowners, and the technologies, the ways that they decide to build have consequences for how communities deal with stormwater. And so this app was designed as a tool, an outreach tool, to target developers, to target sort of the lay public, and help them think about, well, if everyone in your community made the same choices that you made about where you choose to live and how you choose to live, then this is the impact that that would have on the watershed in your area. This is the impact that that might have on flooding. So that's the app. Any questions at this point? Should we jump into the app and actually see it? So this is just my little, so hopefully you've got Flash running on this machine. See if this works. Is it going to open Chrome for me?
As it opened up Explorer.
Okay, there we go. So this is the app, the website, the landing website that I sent you to, macromorphic.com/blog, also has a link to this, to the Flash version. The team that came together, we actually started doing this in 2010, I think. As I said, it was computer scientists, civil engineers, and communication folks coming together to try and design a game. That was actually our initial impulse, was to design a game to help people learn about stormwater management. And in the end, we created this quiz, and this is the Flash version of it. We also released a version, or we created a version for iDevices. So we created an iOS app as well. We never released it in the App Store, because that was an undertaking unto itself. But this is hosted there if you want to go play it. And this is how the gameplay worked. So someone would come to this landing page, they would read this sort of an informative landing page, hopefully, and then they would go through, and I'll ask for a volunteer and we'll take the quiz in a moment. But the way we actually evaluated this experimentally is that we created multiple versions of this, because part of what we were doing is we not only wanted to create this app that would be an outreach tool, but we also wanted to generate insights about different ways of communicating about engineering concepts. So in the study of stormwater, and as we think about the indicators of stormwater and flooding, the indicator that's typically used is something called peak flow. And Emily, if she were here, would be able to tell you, how it's calculated and all that kind of stuff. I'm not going to try. But her team had come up with an alternative way of communicating. Instead of peak flow, which is essentially sort of thinking about the amount of water that is sort of going through a pipe, which is hard to translate into our thinking about a space that is flooded. They created something that's called the hydrological footprint of residence, I think is its full name, the HFR. And the HFR talks about the effects on a watershed in terms of if you had a 100-year event or a 1,000-year event, this is how much of that land would be flooded for how long. And so this was another way of communicating that measure of stormwater's of development's effects on the watershed for stormwater management. And so we created actually multiple versions of the stormwater quiz, and we evaluated those versions experimentally. We used a convenient sample of undergraduate students here at Texas A&M, recruited through public speaking class. And actually one of the good things about that is that because we recruited through public speaking, because the general requirement on campus, a lot of different majors were represented. We also recruited in civil engineering, and so we had sort of a diversity of expertise, if you will, familiarity with these ideas. And we randomly assigned them. We used, if you're curious, we used a Solomon four-group design. Basically what that means is that we had two conditions that had a pre-test and a post-test, two conditions that only had a post-test. And then between those, some folks saw feedback using peak flow, and some folks saw feedback using HFR. So when I talk about the results of the experimental evaluation, we'll come back to this idea. But that's how we set this up, and that's how the various community members, the various stakeholders at A&M came into this, right? So you've got civil engineering modeling of watersheds that are running the back end of the calculations in the quiz. You've got computer science folks who are actually doing the programming and helping us think about questions of design. You've got the communication folks weighing into those design questions and also setting up the experimental evaluation. Okay, so now I've talked enough, right? Let's actually take the quiz. Any volunteers? I just need one. Okay, go ahead. So remind me of your name?
Stephen.
Stephen, okay, Stephen. So you've had time to read this first screen. So which of these is closer to where you live? Do you live in more of a house or an apartment? Okay. So as you go along, you see this. And then as the quiz unfolds, there are these little messages about different sorts of development. And so there's this little informational bullet about rainwater harvesting and the concept of a green roof. So should I go ahead and advance, or ready? Okay, Stephen's taking it, so we'll leave it to him to decide in advance.
Move on. Sorry.
Okay, that's okay.
I do have a yard.
You do have a yard. That's good. It's a good thing. Do you have landscaping? Would you like some? Because I also run a landscaping business. I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
I suppose I do.
Okay, sort of. Okay, so see, and look, we're building your house down here. Isn't that nice? Does it look like your house yet?
We have fewer trees.
Okay.
Newer
How is it newer? Okay. So then there's this little thing about the rain gardens. You have a driveway. So are the driveways shared? In other words, you've got two houses. You have your own driveway. You're not sharing with anybody.
Right.
Okay. This is Texas. Oops. So permeable pavement. So as we start thinking about, well, driveways, what's the issue with driveways? More concrete means less water goes into the ground, more water runs off. And so permeable pavement is a development option that is an alternative. Use permeable pavement instead of just sort of typical concrete. It's better for stormwater management. You have a sidewalk?
No.
No sidewalk. So here's a design flaw, right? So you have no sidewalk. I said no, and now it's oh no, okay, I see, it's not. It's asking me, so you don't have a sidewalk, but are there sidewalks on the opposite side of the street? There are no sidewalks. How do you get around? Oh, okay.
Plus it's Texas, no one wants.
No one wants. I have had someone, I do walk in my neighborhood, and I've never had anyone stop me there, but I used to live in California, and I tried to walk, it was in Santa Barbara, beautiful, beautiful city, and I would walk in the hills, and I had multiple people pull over and say, "Are you okay? Do you need help?
Someone abandoned you.
Where's your vehicle?" Would you say your streets are more wide or narrow? So parks and trails in your general community? How about neighborhood landscaping? So we'll see both. So let's assume you live in a typical city that is near a river and has a population of about 80,000 people. This is Houston, by the way. the calculations that they did is they used part of the sort of Houston watershed to model this typical city. So it's not Houston, but it's based on modeling from Houston, from Harris County. Before any people lived there, a rainstorm of 4.4 inches would flood 176 acres of land for 1 hour. So this, by the way, is the HFR version. I don't have the peak flow version anymore. But the indicator would have just been, I believe, cubic feet over time. I think that's what peak flow is communicated in. So if all 80,000 people in your city made the same stormwater choices that you made, then a rainstorm of 4.6 inches would flood 227 acres of land for 1 hour. So you get to see the difference of the development choices. So and if everyone in your city used green roofs, rainwater harvesting, or permeable pavements, then the flow from the city would be, and this is where the drum roll happens, proceed to results. And so you get to see the difference, right? The ways that implementing these low impact development technologies might lower the HFR closer to the sort of natural condition, if you will. So that's the app, that's the quiz, and we never edited out the language. There is no survey. But that was to prompt people to sort of scroll down, because we embedded this flash in Qualtrics. I don't know if you're familiar with Qualtrics, but it's an online survey tool, and it accepts embedded flash. And so that was how we were able to host the flash quiz inside Qualtrics. And we never actually ran it. I was worried that we were going to run into trouble with folks who didn't have flash working on their machines, but we never got complaints about that. So at least none of the students told me about. So they might have just handled it, but I don't think we did. So that's the quiz. Questions at this point?
I'm just wondering what a green roof is.
So green roof is a roof where they were, instead of just having those asphalt tiles or slate or adobe, they would build a garden on the roof, and that garden would absorb the rainwater and grow plants. And they're useful not just for stormwater management, because the green roof holds water, and that's the impulse, right, for stormwater. But they're particularly useful for absorbing heat, so they make the buildings more efficient, because green roofs absorb a lot more heat and energy than the sort of typical, I can't think of it. It's the asphalt. What's the shingles? The typical shingles. In Texas, if you drive around, though, you'll notice that another alternative is they just use more reflective surfaces on the shingles, right? So you see more light-colored white roofs, beige roofs, which is not what you'd see in Illinois. At least not as much. Yeah, and green roofs are somewhat controversial as well, because you get a lot of those benefits, but you can also get the same benefits from, putting a reflective surface on your roof. In any case, you get other benefits from the green roof, but you don't get the stormwater.
There's a green roof experiment on top of 130 architecture buildings.
Oh, cool. Yeah. I think there are others on campus as well, the newer buildings that are trying to go for the LEED certification. That's one of the ways that you can, I think platinum is the highest. Is that if you have a green roof, that's one of the ways that you can try and lower the footprint. Other questions?
I know the modeling under the scene is not really what you're working on, but it seems strange to me that the rain harvesting system by itself would end up with a lower score than permeable pavement and rain harvesting system.
Yeah, that does look strange, doesn't it?
I think so.
Yeah, I'm not sure actually why that is. That's, it could be two things. It could be something strange in the modeling. It could be something strange in the programming of the game, right?
Yeah.
So it might just be that the wrong figures were cut and pasted in.
Right.
But I'll email Emily actually about it, because in playing the game, the way this quiz works is there are only so many different combinations of choices, and there is a set of calculations for every set of choices you could possibly make. And so there may actually be some reason, but it seems strange, doesn't it? Now I have to remember all of his cheese choices to be able to reproduce it. I may have to email you if that's okay and find out where you live.
Right.
Yeah. There you go.
Did y'all, because I have a hard time visualizing that many acres to hour, is there, a way to translate that a little bit better for like the common?
Yeah, I think there certainly would have been. And that's actually one of the things we'll come back to at the conclusion, which is this quiz really only scratches the surface. So imagine this team of undergraduates and graduate students and faculty meeting together over the course of an entire year, and the deadline is coming, and we have to get this app so that we can go to so that we can field the study, so that we can collect the data, so that we can go to the fair. And so the done became the enemy of perfect. But we had really, I think one of the more exciting things is that in the first semester, we spent the first semester sort of dreaming big. And this was, I'm showing you what I think was probably the most successful project that came out of this larger initiative, but there were actually other efforts. For example, we'll come back to this, but there was another group within our team that worked on creating more of an interactive simulation-based game using an open source simulation engine, Lin City. This is the open source. It's been made open source. The engine behind SimCity. Are you familiar with SimCity? You build a little town and try and make everyone happy in the town. And that was just a larger, farther goal for us to reach within the year. That makes sense. But I'll talk more about that. And also, it sort of speaks to the team that we had. It was trying to balance the desire to make this really driven by the sort of undergraduate, their ideas, their design impulse, their choices, and so this reflects that balance as well. Yeah. And in fact, the peak flow measure versus the HFR is at least an effort to talk about. We think about flooding space, I think, more so than we think about flooding in terms of the flow of water over time. I think at least thinking spatially makes a little bit more sense. But you're right, a visual I think would have been more. Should we talk about the experimental results? Okay. So we were really looking at two things. We were looking at how gameplay, pre and post test, changed people's knowledge about stormwater management and their sort of behavioral intentions about their willingness to go after these low-impact development technologies in their community and so forth. And we were also curious to see if getting feedback differently, if getting feedback using the HFR, getting feedback using peak flow would magnify the gameplay or would change the game plan in a way. And so we looked at, I want to focus mainly on just the effects of gameplay on these knowledge and behavioral, attitudinal behavioral outcomes, because unfortunately, there really weren't that many reliable differences between giving people the feedback using peak flow and giving people the feedback using HFR. The one reliable difference that we could find, I think, is particularly interesting given the design of the game, though. And so we'll circle back to it. So as we conducted the experiment, we found that taking the quiz didn't really have significant effects on people's knowledge of the stormwater effects. In other words, the fact that stormwater can have effects on flooding, erosion, damage to property, loss of health to aquatic species, discoloration of tap water were the specific things that we quizzed them on. And it wasn't that they didn't know and then at the end still didn't know. It's just they started with a pretty good knowledge base about the fact that stormwater management has consequences on those outcomes. Does that make sense? So there wasn't, I think they started it, the average was like 93% correct, and I think afterwards it was 94% correct, or 92, 98. So there just wasn't a lot of space to move. There was some space to move in the knowledge of stormwater causes. So what are the causes on stormwater management? So for example, the differential effects of new parks, rainwater harvesting, new buildings, new green space, so sort of these development alternatives. If you're building more and building more green, the way that has different effects on stormwater management. And we did see improvement there. We did see a change there. It's a medium-sized effect. We also asked them about their development, their knowledge about these development technologies, not just low-impact development technology, but we asked them about the effects of wider sidewalks, shared driveways, permeable pavement, rainwater harvesting, green roofs, narrow streets, and new parking lots on stormwater. So is this going to create more stormwater runoff or less for us? And there we saw a really powerful change. We saw a strong effect. And if you think about it, if you think about the gameplay is really oriented to teaching about these low versus relatively higher impact development technologies. And so that's where we saw the most powerful knowledge difference. We also asked them about their willingness to take action now. In other words, now that you've learned this, are you willing to do things like tell your friends about low-impact development, about voting for political candidates who support low-impact development, making these choices at your own home? Are you going to install rainwater capture devices? Are you more or less likely to install a green roof? Those kinds of things. And we also saw a powerful increase there, a really powerful effect of another strong effect, which was probably one of the most exciting things for us coming out of the game. Now, whether behavioral intention will actually translate into behavior, and keep in mind this is a convenient sample. These are not homeowners by and large, right? They're mainly renters, and some of these technologies renters can afford, like a rain barrel, but mostly not so much. So it's an important caveat. Still, as a proof of concept, this is sort of where we're headed. And then lastly, one of the questions that we asked them about was some environment and economics scale. We asked them about the degree to which they believed that environmental interests should trump economic interests. And what we expected to happen is we expected to see a shift. We expected to see people saying, oh, stormwater management is important. We should really be taking care of the environment first in our development instead of the reverse. The problem is that the way we worded the questions, we sort of recapitulated what I think is probably a counterproductive way of thinking about the relationship between the environment and an economic interest. That is, we held them in opposition to one another. And what we found was this small negative effect. In other words, people were more likely to say that the environment shouldn't trump the economic interests. And the ways we interpreted that post hoc, we did a couple of post hoc analyses trying to make sense of it. And especially given the importance of the learning about low impact development technologies in this, the way we interpreted that post hoc was saying, well, they've learned that we can develop using these technologies in a way that still protects the environment. And so, of course, neither economic nor environmental interest should trump one another, that we should be able to have our cake and eat it too. So that was something that surprised us a little bit. I mentioned that we saw one small difference when communicating the feedback using the HFR versus peak flow measure, and where we saw it was in their understanding of development technologies. And if you think about it, where they saw those numbers the most was in association with development technology. So in a way, if we were likely to see any difference related to the sort of different engineering indicators for communicating about development technologies, it was going to be there because that's what the game was really designed to communicate about. That's where we use the numbers. So that's how I explain the sort of lackluster differences between HFR and peak flow as a measure. So those are the results of the findings. Questions at this point about the experimental evaluation? If you're curious about the modeling as well, that I think is a specific question about the design. But as this was, as I was invited by Robin to come and give this talk, our article based on this project, which is led really by the faculty on the article, but Tommy Jo was another leader on the project. Tommy Jo is, this is Tommy Jo right here. She's now a civil engineer in Houston. But she was getting her master's degree in this larger project informed her master's work, mainly the modeling behind the stormwater footprint. So on my website is a link to that article. And so if you're curious, one of the things that we struggled with in this article for sustainability was giving equal space to the diverse audiences. Also, because we were doing such an interdisciplinary focused project, in some ways the data that we generated didn't fit in any of our disciplinary homes. And so we really needed this interdisciplinary journal. But I also want to talk about the team itself. And as I said, one of the most exciting things for me was that this was the sort of best experience of really integrating and serving equally the Masters of Scholarship Teaching and Practice that I've been a part of. And this is our team. As you can tell, we had a lot of fun. We went to DC. The team worked together, and it wasn't always easy. We spent a lot of time kind of trying to make sense of what is it that you do, and what is it that I do, and how can I help here? And you know, people were busy; they were doing other things, and so you know, we dreamt big, and then got something done, and we felt really good about it. But we also felt like there was so much more to do. But I think that we were able to generate scholarly. We were able to generate a real artifact for multiple platforms. We were able to do so using sort of cutting-edge civil engineering research. And the student team actually was able to use this project to do quite well. They won, I mentioned the honorable mention at the P3 competition, but they also won here, the A&M Undergraduate Student Research Week. They won first place in their category for that. And Alyssa, who is a civil engineering undergrad, won for her thesis, her best thesis for her work related to this project. So a lot of positive outcomes for the students, for the faculty, for the group came out of this, and I think that's really part of the value of doing projects like this. And it also speaks to the sort of this as a test case for thinking about app development as part of the larger mission of disaster studies. This is a screenshot from Lynn City, the larger image there on the left, and I mentioned that we had dreamt big. We really were inspired by our conversations with a guy named Lars Doucette, who's now a game developer in Houston. But Lars was getting his master's degree in visualization sciences. And he developed a game, I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but it was a game where you had to optimize your city's use of technology for power and water, and there were environmental trade-offs for all those choices to defend your city from the zombie onslaught. And so his work was mainly focused on the design of the game, and there was less of an evaluation component to it. And so, but in our conversations with him, he really inspired us to reach and try and create a real game as opposed to a quiz that was more immersive, that involved more choices, that involved even more learning about the sort of environmental consequences of our choices. And so I think there's still a lot more untapped potential in game development for the sort of Center for Emergency Informatics and the disaster studies mission writ large. And I think about the simulations that are done at Disaster City, this is a map of the Disaster City. And I think there's opportunities for doing a project like this, even if the simulation isn't happening in a game that's on someone's computer, but it's happening in a game that is unfolding at Disaster City. But then it means bringing in a diversity of stakeholders and having a longer time frame and having more of these conversations about what you do and what I do and how do we make sure that everyone gets something out of this project at the end. And that's hard. It involves a lot of work. So that is that's the long and the short of it. That's the stormwater footprint quiz. I'm happy to field any questions at this point about the project, the quiz, anything else that you want to talk about. Thank you.
Josh, did you do any investigation of the results versus people's perception of the economic versus environment question? Because just looking at the results that we ran through for our example, it wasn't that big of a shift. So if I'm looking at that and you tell me, oh, well, what's the economic impact, or what should the economic impact of the environment be? It's like that stuff sounds like it's expensive, but I'm saving maybe 5%. Yeah.
So we punted. If you go and you downloaded the sustainability article, the editors asked us the same question, and basically what we used was the old standby of this is a valuable empirical question for future research. One of the things that, though, is a real limitation of the study is we didn't, and it's a really kind of obvious thing when you think about low-impact development, obvious now anyway, is we didn't ask people about their perceptions of the costs. And we don't include any messages about the costs of these technologies. And depending on what you're looking at between a 10% or 20% increase in the cost of your material, say for permeable pavement. And that isn't something we incorporated into the app or incorporated into our evaluation. So, another thing that we raised too is that, it's easy for someone in this kind of artificial situation to make those claims. And someone who's really a developer or someone who's really a homeowner and they're doing a kind of calculus at a different level. And they're really going to have to spend the money. But we wanted to include some evaluation. We wanted to include some evaluative component of the game.
I think this would be really useful just for city staff and useful because a lot of what we see is that an individual can't really make those decisions because of codes and ordinances that you can't put a green mark on your home or communal pavement. So that would be
or homeowner association covenants. As well. I want to zero-scape my front lawn, but the homeowners association has something to say about that. Yeah, I think that there are communities that have figured that out, and I think that these tools have that outreach potential. And thinking about audience, we really just had a lay audience in mind, but thinking about policymakers as an audience is, that might involve sort of a different design. It might involve a different set of questions. In the other simulation-based work that I've done, not in the academy, but before I came back, we were able to design more immersive experiences, and they were aimed at decision makers, policymakers, to give them a sense of what are the decisions that people you're making these policies for have to make, right? And then how do you have to go through optimizing as a way for them to kind of think through what are the implications of this policy choice. So I would love to do more work like this. I'd also love to tie it into Emily, and there are other folks here on campus doing this work. Does a lot of agent-based modeling as well, and so the potential for creating a game that mirrors simulation work is there, but the challenge is finding the funding mechanisms, finding the community of scholars that are here and that are interested, and that's something that I think that CEI can really do, is make those connections through talks like this and other ways as well.
Can you say more about how you're connecting it to disasters and preparation? It seems to me there would be some questions in here about things people can do to retrofit homes or something like that. Stronger to disaster.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons that I just sort of selfishly I thought I have people's attention for like 30 minutes. I'm going to tell them about all my research, but I also wanted to kind of position this within the larger context of disaster work that I do. And when we designed the stormwater game, we made a lot of arguments about the reason you need to do this is because flooding is a real concern, and the way that we deal with flooding is these sort of choices that we make when flooding isn't on the horizon, when we're not thinking about is my space going to flood. And so one of the things that I think that this kind of gaming can do is serve as an outreach tool, serve as an informational tool, thinking tool, when you don't have the motivation of a disaster that's just happened. We're thinking more carefully about hazardous materials after West, but how do you the relying on the disaster as a motivation for policy making, as a motivation for retrofitting your home, is really, it's trouble, right? Because we don't want disasters to happen, so we shouldn't have to wait for them. And also, post-disaster, all those decisions become somewhat more fraught, right? Because they're wrapped into the sort of politics of who was at fault and how do we make sure that doesn't happen again and so forth. So part of it is, I think these tools are useful in that pre-crisis space when we're not thinking about disasters at all. I think you could tailor the tool to speak specifically about you know, to target a community that had recently gone through a flooding event, or to focus on, say, other kinds of retrofitting, you know, like hurricane preparation, and the kind of retrofitting that can be done there. So I don't really feel like I'm answering your question, but that's sort of what immediately came to mind. Is that in the neighborhood? Was there something specific that you were thinking about?
I'll do some details.
Yeah.
I'll just say, I think it has great possibilities. It's part of the work on this question about what if all the neighbors make some decision you make how to get great.
Yeah.
So I'll just say that I believe that if you want to see it more developed for that.
Mm-hmm.
Another issue that I'm thinking about would be nice if we can figure out a way to work in something about equity. So I'm thinking about social vulnerability.
Mm-hmm.
There's some folks who are placed back to where they are. And those tend to be in marginal areas, or minor areas that tend to prone to flood.
Mm-hmm.
And there are decisions that folks in suburbs, upstream, or whatever, are making that
Upwater,
exacerbate
definitely.
social vulnerability. A question that could be added to this that makes people think, oh, who else am I on?
Exactly. Well, it is kind of that community-wide focus. And that was actually part of the impulse behind, we were going to call it Storm City, was to help people think about a community as a whole instead of thinking about just their choices in isolation. Because you're right, I mean, the watershed ignores, in some ways, the boundaries of those social vulnerabilities, right? It just is there. And the development choices that get made, well, down,
Or this goes to Jamie's point too, that if you were to be able to express this spatially, so it's like, well, where my house is in the watershed versus where, so sort of showing where those whatever 200 acres of flooding are actually taking place and who lives there, which may or may not be the person who's taking the quiz, who's saying, oh well, you know, my suburb's at the headwaters of the basin, or yeah, I'm above flood stage, so I'm fine. But that doesn't mean that someone else isn't going to get.
So they're like concentrated effects like this. You take 5%, that's spread across the whole water. Right? But there are some places where it's a little 5%.
Right. Because the flooding mitigation is different, the stormwater infrastructure is different.
So in the research that you did and the students did to develop this, where is this kind of work farthest along? Because it seems like really attractive in terms of thinking about broader impacts, communication, taking kind of the science and engaging people, stakeholders in it, but it also seems like something that is, well, if this was a year-long effort, that in most, let's say, 3-year NSF funding cycles, if you want to have some broader impact kind of things, you do all this research and you're like, oh, wouldn't it be great to like pursue the, develop some game or app or that kind of thing. Are there examples of sort of things that are really far along and sort of the gold standard for doing this? Or are there ways that you can see to kind of, so I'm thinking about on campus, there are lots of different people who are working in areas where this could be applied or useful, but don't have the expertise in and of themselves to do it. So are there ways that we can sort of speed up that design process so that we can more quickly move the science into the...
Yeah. You know, I think that in terms of what I know about, I think the real leaders in educational gaming, you know, if I think about where Lucette is right now, I mean, he left the academy to go work in the private sector, to work on educational games. And he was working on a game actually to teach cellular biology. And it's a really cool game, you know, you are a little cell and you have to make choices and, you know, you evolve and along the way you're learning these basic concepts of cellular biology. In terms of on campus, this was a $10,000 EPA grant for this collaboration, and so there are little pockets of money for it. In terms of NSF, our dream was for 2.0 was to find a larger pocket of money, because one of the things that was really a sort of weak spot for us is we were relying essentially on volunteers for the programming. And to try and do something that was more complex, I mean, that's, if you're trying to compete with the sort of the large-scale simulation games that are on the market now and have any fidelity with something that, say, Blizzard produces or something that's coming out of EA, that's a big undertaking. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if there's an understanding that, at least at sort of our traditional funding mechanisms, of the potential. But you would think that even if you were able to, and that was one of the things that was nice about the thinking about trying to do this for the App Store, because that was a more targeted market. I mean, it had pitfalls in other ways, but it was a more targeted market. It was a sort of lower cost of entry. It was a development platform that one of the volunteers on the team, the students was, and he wanted to program, he wanted to learn how to program for iOS, and so there was motivation there. I feel like everyone has an iOS app they're working on these days. Like everyone has one somewhere that they're involved in. But I mean, I think that you could very easily make the argument that for broader impact, that because you're making a real artifact and you're testing it and refining it over the course of a 3-year research project, that at the end you won't just have the Scully insight, which in and of itself will be valuable. Right? There's impacts there, but you'll also then have this built-in dissemination tool. Yeah, when the team sort of finished the project, we stopped working on it, moved on to other things. But yeah, I think it's exciting in the potential of it, but we haven't pushed it along much from this.
How would it be to connect to another app? Editing. The extension folks have disaster education network.
No, I haven't.
The text A&M program has it. Materials. Stuff out.
Yeah. I've seen the Red Cross ones, the hurricane app and the first aid app that they have, but I haven't seen even that. No.
Sure.
Yeah. This is one of those things, right, where even something that's happening in my own backyard. Yeah, I think that the challenge is most of the apps that are out there. We were talking about the hazards data that exists in communities before we started to talk today. And my dream for that hazards data was to create an interactive app for first responders, because as I was going to these meetings with first responders, they all have Android and iPhone devices. And so they can't access any of that data. Even if it was just a map, even if it was just I'm rolling up to this scene, is there tier 2 filed for this place? What's here? Where is it? Whereas right now, what they'd have to do is call the emergency management office and find out. Even better, let's tie it into some of the location aware stuff, and they're coming to an emergency scene, they turn that app on, and then it starts beeping to say, there's this here, and so forth. I think the key, though, is that most of the apps that exist right now are informational. The main, it's sort of the main format of interaction, the main sort of model of communication is information dissemination. We're going to put information that you need to know in this app, and then you can go and get it. Like, that's my experience with the Hurricane app from Red Cross. It's mainly this sort of Red Cross preparation materials, but in app form, which is great because I have it, and it's at my. There's also, like, in the event of a hurricane, I feel like I can go to that app and I'll have it right at my fingertips. So it's not that it's bad, it's just that, and there's other models out there too. That might be done.
I think there's an opportunity, if you can figure out a way to partner with the extension folks, to have it used in an interactive way. Because it's connected to decision agents who are out in the field, who have a need to have their decisions informed. So they can use it and have training.
We also talked about, in our initial I call it the dreaming semester, the dreaming big semester. We also talked about creating an app that would plug in just to a sort of existing larger social networks, and like Facebook. There are a lot of games that are played on Facebook. At the time, I think, is Farmville still a thing? You know, Farmville was really, really exploding. And so we had, we talked about tying into an app in that sense, sort of tying into another online platform as a way to have that reach, if you will. But in the end, we sort of developed into platforms that were available to us. Flash. We wanted a Flash app because we wanted to be able just to host it on our website. And then iOS, we had someone that was interested, and because the quiz is so straightforward, I mean, anyone with a programming background could look at that and say that there's not a huge technical hurdle in getting that done. Not to speak ill of the good work they did. I mean, there was a lot of work that went into it. It made me understand how much more work must go into video games that I play on my Xbox. But so that's sort of the choices that we made. The choices that we made about platform were in part driven by sort of what should we do, but also by what can we do. Cool. How are we doing on time? 10 o'clock. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.